and good afternoon to everybody. I'm Ray McGrath, and I've spent a large part of my life working in war zones, war and disaster zones. First of all, I spent 18 years as a soldier, as a military engineer. And then since the mid-1980s, I've worked with aid organizations around the world, primarily in various aspects of response, humanitarian response in conflict. And what I want to talk about today is something that's very specific to our times, to what we're seeing at this moment in places like Syria and Yemen, Afghanistan, and other countries, but specifically this chaotic kind of warfare. And this is very important because there's a tendency for us to in the humanitarian sector to slot things into boxes. So we think in terms of emergency response, development, peace and conflict, and we all have our own approach to defining our work. But there's something that we've discovered in recent years, I would say really since 2010, so in the past 10 years, is that the nature of conflict has begun to change. And this talk is actually a summary of a series of lectures and a 2-day workshop that I've done in various places before the pandemic forced us all to stay in our homes, which really addresses the problems of working in asymmetric war. And so that's really where I'll start. And I'd say that when I entitled the talk for Joe, I called it Addressing Life-Sustaining Needs of Civilians in Complex War Zones. And that's another way of referring to what we'd see as modern asymmetric warfare. So there's a tendency to talk of aid in conflict in almost generic terms, as though there exists a one-size-fits-all approach for agencies responding in war zones. And while that thinking may have some relevance when implementing programs in low-intensity conflict, where some areas may experience very few direct effects over long periods, responding to the essential needs of non-combatants in asymmetric war presents very complex and unpredictable challenges for humanitarian organizations. In order to examine those challenges, it's going to be helpful to explain some of the relevant terminology and baseline assumptions. So what do I mean by asymmetric warfare? The nature of major conflicts, those we tend to refer to as high intensity, have changed substantially in recent years, arguably at least partly a response to George W. Bush's war on terror. Whereas asymmetric conflict in the past referred primarily to the imbalance of traditional battlefield power available to informal guerrilla forces in comparison with formal national armies, and how that imbalance often appeared against all the odds to disadvantage the formal and nominally stronger force in favor of the guerrillas. This was not a new concept. Sun Tzu and other theorists had long recognized the potential advantages available to the commander who ignored the standard and established warfighting rules. However, in recent years, the asymmetric nature of conflict, this imbalance in some wars, have expanded in a number of ways which can be headlined as follows. Firstly, the number of distinct combatant forces engaged within a geographical battlefield can be substantial, ranging from 5 or 6 to sometimes tens and even some would argue hundreds, although that tends to be where smaller groups form out of larger groups. The variance of conflict objectives between parties to the conflict, resulting very commonly in shifting alliances and overlapping lines of control. So very often, although you will have a group of forces, of distinct forces, fighting a common enemy, their specific objectives may be quite different. Some may have geographical objectives that will limit their willingness to fight in other areas. Others may have tribal differences, philosophical differences with other groups also fighting the same enemy, so nominally on the same side, but who will not fight together and will sometimes even fight each other. And so this variance of objectives adds to the complexity. A great diversity of weaponry. War fighting is about killing, and killing involves weaponry. Now, in what you might call the traditional vision of the guerrilla war, the powerful army or armies would have air forces and a range of artillery, armored forces, very well armed infantry, and guerrillas would really be less well armed and would depend on informal strategies and ambushes to gain an advantage from surprise. What's happened in recent years is that some forces have, typically government forces, have tended to be armed and have the war fighting and command skills that you would expect from an organized and uniformed army. They tend to use common tactics. But rather than being these rather disorganized groups, opposition forces are very often made use of informal weaponry, which has actually given them a direct advantage. One obvious, not new, but one that has developed through terrorist use, but has now become a battlefield weapon, is what's commonly known as the suicide bomb, the improvised explosive device, which can be carried on a person or very commonly in battle on a vehicle. And so a vehicle is packed with a huge amount of explosives and sent to crash through a front line and then explode perhaps near a headquarters, will have a similar impact as a major bombing attack, and is unexpected. So the surprise adds to the power of that kind of attack. There's also increasingly the use of drones and the use of what previously would have been thought of as little more than toys, which, because the young people, you know, fighting in these groups are very often computer savvy or well educated in IT, and consequently they have the ability to turn things that you can buy normally in the shops, you know, drones and things of that nature, and weaponize them. There's then also an acceptance that non-combatant populations may become critical and impact substantially on power balance between armed groups. And this is a strange reversal of what as aid agencies and NGOs we would very often have referred to as community acceptance. When you have a lot of armed groups fighting in an area, some of those groups, because of their behavior, you know, within the communities, or because of knowing communities, will gain community acceptance. And that community acceptance can be very powerful in terms of increasing their warfighting capacity. It's almost an incidental impact, very often of good behavior, of not behaving badly in towns, etc. The peripheral involvement of neighboring states, you know, either for or against different groups, can have a major impact. Even before any talk of training or provision of weapons, etc. Just a neighboring country allowing forces to pass backwards and forwards across a border can have a major impact on the war as a whole. And then, of course, as we've seen in Syria and in other areas of the world, the involvement of international forces. Now, one of the things that, of course, has happened is very often those international forces are fighting a different war. They may be solely targeting forces that they see as terrorist. And that can lead to very complex situations where, for instance, you can have the United States training and providing weapons to the opposition forces in Syria. but at the same time attacking one of the most effective members, militarily effective members of that group, previously al-Nusra, because they were considered to be to have arisen out of Al-Qaeda. And so external forces can have a major impact on the war and make it even more chaotic. And then, of course, the involvement of commanders and soldiers who have little or no knowledge before the conflict began of fighting wars. And so they're unlikely to have a good knowledge of the of international humanitarian law, of the laws of armed conflict, and neither might they have a good understanding of the norms of interaction between combatants and non-combatants, nor of the legal and customary requirements to allow access and passage for humanitarian aid and medical assistance. At the same time, one of the very worrying aspects of asymmetric war that we're beginning to see is what we might term as a war with no foreseeable end. Because once wars become so complex and so chaotic, it becomes more and more difficult to find common ground as a basis for negotiation between the different combatant groups. And consequently, you can have a war that seems to be coming to an end, and then it starts up again, and it can seem as though it will never end. And we don't know. There's a possibility that could become a reality. If we look that in Syria in 2013, most observers, most experts would have forecast that the war couldn't go on longer than 2014 or at the outside 2015. We're now in 2020, and a war that's been reported to have ended on innumerable occasions or virtually ended still continues. And that's obviously a major concern. There's also something very specific from the humanitarian side, which needs to be included in any consideration of how we define an asymmetric war, and that's the tendency of United Nations and some governments to talk of humanitarian pauses or truces, commonly in besieged areas. The idea being to allow humanitarian aid to be taken to non-combatants, to civilians, or of evacuation of combatants and wounded, of non-combatants and wounded. This has been quite cynically used and undermined as a kind of reconceptualized military strategy, which allows siege forces to be reinforced and frankly, as we saw in a number of areas of Syria, of whole neighborhoods to be depopulated under the under a pretense um, of allowing besieged populations to escape from the area. And of course, this influences the whole balance of power within the war. So it's going to be reasonable to assume that in future wars, especially non-international armed conflicts, civil wars, non-formal combatant forces will not comply with tactical warfighting norms, and may be unaware of international humanitarian law and the laws of armed conflict. We can perhaps assume that, unless steps are taken to change that. And one thing that was very specific in Syria was, whereas very often you would have looked to the International Committee of the Red Cross to train combatant forces in international humanitarian law and the laws relating to medical and humanitarian aid, that didn't happen in Syria in opposition areas, and consequently that, as we'll go on to, resulted in that becoming a responsibility of aid organizations themselves. So with that definition, what I'd like to do is look at some of the critical realities of delivering humanitarian aid to non-combatants within that asymmetric conflict environment. Understanding the humanitarian engagement conflict, we might subhead it. The overall result of such asymmetry can be an understanding of chaos theory as being generally more useful than a military warfighting theory. The result of confrontation between diverse groups employing the full range of strategies, from traditional military theory to random tactics, makes any attempt to analyze or predict outcomes little more than guesswork. And so for any agency wanting to give humanitarian assistance, access immediately becomes a critical factor, as do the reasons for underpinning the decision to respond. And I would summarize them under a number of key considerations that those agencies must make. The first is legality. In order to ensure local and international staff have what protection is afforded, and I should add local international staff and local partners, that they have whatever protection is afforded to humanitarian workers, especially where access is across international borders. There must be a legal basis for the intervention. Now, you know, this can vary quite dramatically from conflict to conflict. So, for instance, as head of Mercy Corps' response in North Syria, I first of all obtained the necessary level of support internally in Turkey from the authorities there, just to ensure that they were happy about us crossing the border and what the rules were going to be. I obviously can't go into it in this presentation, but that can take a long time, and it involves negotiation and discussions at many different levels. And one of the common mistakes is very often to get an agreement at a very high level, which has no relevance when you get to the border, or equally making arrangements with authorities close to the border that do not have a stamp of approval from central government. You've got to talk at every level. You've got to have a clear understanding at every level. And of course, in some circumstances, you might get that understanding, but a government may be cautious or unwilling to actually give approval. Effectively, they would be turning a blind eye. So you then have to look at exactly what you're using for your basis to give cross-border assistance. Now, we adopted a view in Syria that the Syrian government was not allowing aid to be delivered in sufficient quantities. The Syrian Red Crescent was doing its best to deliver into some areas, but that was problematic, and it was never at a large scale. And consequently, what we had to do was to look at how we might justify or give legal basis to an intervention that delivered aid to civilians where it was not available from elsewhere. Now, first of all, we felt that there was a clear indication in humanitarian law that while the Syrian government could refuse to allow cross-border assistance from neighboring states, if it had a good reason, it couldn't make an arbitrary decision that such aid couldn't happen where it was clearly needed. And then we also had the fact that the International Court of Justice had ruled that the provision of humanitarian assistance in a principal manner does not amount to an intervention. Now, I was stretching the limits there of interpretation, if you like, because that refers to states rather than organizations or individuals. But we felt that it provided a reasoned basis to justify life-sustaining and life-saving operations in support of vulnerable civilians. And that life-sustaining and life-saving operations is critical in that case. Now, later in July 2014 and in other resolutions that followed, the Security Council made it legal by resolution 2165 anyway, which provided a formal legal umbrella for cross-border assistance. But from 2012 up till July 2014, we were operating under this almost informal legal umbrella. Now, we could also, of course, argue that there was historical precedent for such intervention where communities were at great risk. It also is essential in these situations that that the organizations who are going to take on these responsibilities make an internal organizational commitment. There is no such thing as no risk programming in active war zones. Even the wrong place, wrong time element of risk is substantial in that kind of situation. And so there must be a clear understanding and commitment at the highest level in an organization, to the board level, which means that the engagement between the senior management on the ground and the headquarters must be quite clear, to ensure that everyone understands the nature of the commitment that's being made. Now, what I did with Mercy Corps to ensure that there was no doubt for those who were legally responsible in the international and the European boards of Mercy Corps, I agreed with the senior management on the ground a two-sentence summary of how we saw the situation, and how I explained it was, I'll quote it directly: "We have accepted that the battlefield is our operational context and have built access, operations, and security structures that recognize we are working in an environment over which we have no control." And that's obviously important. For the team, that has become an operational reality. The battlefield is our office. Now, it sounds quite dramatic, but the reason for that wording was literally to make the senior management of the organization and the boards sit back and recognize that this was a very real risk or high risk commitment that they were taking on. Now, of course, you talk about risk. Risk just becomes greater if you do nothing to mitigate it. So mitigating risk, the risk to the staff and to operations themselves, begins with a number of fairly obvious calculations. The first being that the humanitarian outcomes must be proportional when measured against risk to staff and beneficiaries. Now, I mentioned this briefly a little earlier. In practice, that means that such programs must be confined to life-sustaining responses. Realistically, that means supply of food and water. I should say that it's also medical response, but medical response is conducted by specialist agencies and is covered by different elements of international law. So I'm not referring to medical here. Now, delivering food supplies and water is not enough on its own. It must be delivered in high enough volumes to justify the risks to staff, to partners, and to beneficiary communities themselves. And obviously to the organization, because it is a serious risk to the existence of an aid organization if it takes on unwise or unrealistic level of risk. So that's the first thing, is to be very clear that you are taking on a program that will help a sufficient number of people to be able to say this is worth the risk. Then you need to work out how you're going to engage with the people doing the fighting. Now, as I said earlier, the International Red Cross weren't involved in North Syria, and that immediately meant that responsibility was totally ours, where in other circumstances it might have been shared with the ICRC. The only effective way to do that is, first of all, to establish protocols for engagement with combatant forces. And internally, that means you must first establish what might be termed your red lines. What will be operationally and ethically acceptable, and not expose staff, partners, or beneficiaries to avoidable risk. In summary, engagement with commanders of controlling combatant groups in each area will focus on negotiating a number of things. First of all, access, and then to explain who you are. Access being to allow you into those areas and through those areas. To explain who you are, the impartial nature of your work, and to agree the limits of your engagement. And I'll come back to impartial a little bit later. And to agree the limits of your engagement. Combatant groups must understand that they will not receive aid, nor will you pay taxes or fees in return for passage or access, and that you won't require or accept armed escorts, and will not share information about beneficiaries nor allow interference in the beneficiary selection process. You then agree procedures and contact points which would allow both you and them to report and discuss infringements, diversions, and disagreements. So in other words, if things go wrong, how are we going to contact each other? Who do we contact? Who has the authority to deal with those situations? And it was a procedure which in Syria, and I've found over the years in most countries, if it's done properly with the majority of combatant groups, it works fairly effectively. In Syria, given the number of different combatant forces, and we were dealing only with opposition forces, just simply because there weren't any options of dealing with government forces, because technically, from the government's viewpoint, we were illegal. Although initially we had been working on both sides of the conflict, but then withdrew from the government side because we weren't allowed to do anything effectively. And at the same time, the government was saying in any case that they would throw us out if we didn't stop working on the opposition side. So that engagement is normally, if done properly, quite successful. But you know, we spent nearly 3 months, this may surprise you, negotiating with Islamic State in North Syria, and continued that negotiation until it became clear that, let's say, the opposition to international aid, and especially international aid that they didn't control, was, you might say, philosophically unacceptable. And then they declared international NGOs illegal anyway. And so sadly we had to withdraw from the IS-controlled areas, and lost some access to some 230,000 beneficiaries overnight. But there really wasn't any option, because that would have gone beyond all our red lines if we if control of that aid had fallen into the hands of IS. And of course, that would have also put us in an impossible position contractually with our donors. And then operational considerations must begin with the recognition that there are some things that are almost accepted as the norm, but frankly, to anybody who has worked regularly in conflict, seems like madness. If you think in terms of food aid delivery, you would almost always have a mental picture of a convoy. I can honestly say that in conflict areas, to use convoys is almost suicidal. And it's not just a case of drivers, of local staff, of commodities and vehicles being destroyed. It's also making it impossible to work in those areas, because there will be no trust left, you know, with communities in those areas. And that's the same reason that you don't do large-scale distributions in those areas. And so the approach that we took in Syria, and which I've generally taken always in war zones, is you would almost never have more than 2 trucks traveling together, and at the same time never use logos. Now that immediately gives you a problem with donors. Every donor wants every bag of grain to have the source of it you know, printed on it, wants vehicles to have EU or USAID or DFID stickers, not DFID stickers anymore, I don't suppose. But I can assure you that that if it comes down to saying to those donors, this is the only acceptable way we will deliver. We're not there to advertise the country that the food comes from. We're there to keep people alive, and consequently, that becomes very important. I realize that I'm running way over time here. Perhaps what I'll do is just end up with the final with a final point. There is no such thing, as we've already said, as a no-risk conflict. There will always be those risks. But I would say that the one essential thing that any organization, any individual doing that kind of work is aware of is that you can't be present in a conflict and delivering assistance in a conflict without influencing that conflict. In effect, you become part of the conflict. And to deny that is to deny a reality. And that's very important because it does influence how people will perceive your intervention. So all I'd say is that, impossible though it may at times seem, these kind of conflicts cause massive problems and displacement for civilians, for non-combatants, and we have to continue refining our ability to respond to the most urgent problems facing those communities. I'll leave it there. Thank you. I'm sorry, I seem to have gone on longer than I intended. I don't know, Joe, is